The forecast said 18 inches. Arrival, Monday night. I read it Friday evening, the same day the termination notice's 7-day clock ran out. I walked to the equipment barn, ran the startup check. Engine, hydraulics, blade, block heater. Everything operational. I locked the barn door, came inside, and looked at the forecast one more time. Then I went to bed. The HOA had fined me $400 for tire tracks on a decorative snow apron. 11 years of service. Not one missed run. 47 completed runs this season alone. I had written a non-interference clause into the service agreement in 2016, after a board member flagged me down mid-run to tell me how to do my job. The clause said the HOA could not penalize my equipment's operation. The fine violated it. The agreement gave me 7 days to terminate, no cause required. I sent the notice. The clock ran. Monday night the storm arrived. Tuesday morning the road had 18 inches of mountain snow on it and no plow truck assigned to it. The county said, "Private road, not our obligation." The emergency contractor said, 4 hours minimum. 2 residents tried to drive out. Both got buried on the grades. I plowed my own property at 4:30 a.m., came inside, poured a second coffee, and watched the snow from the kitchen window. The barn was 40 feet away. The truck was warm. The door was locked. Before we dive into this story, I want to know, where in the world are you watching from? Let me know below, and don't forget to smash like and subscribe. Walt Greer had been running equipment on mountain roads since he was 22 years old, when his father had handed him the keys to a 1971 grader and told him the county road contract was his to manage if he could keep the northern section clear through March. He had kept it clear. He had kept every road he was responsible for clear, on time, in conditions that would have stopped a less experienced operator at the equipment barn door. He had spent 30 years as a civil engineer and heavy equipment operator for the state's Mountain Infrastructure Division before retiring to the family property in 2009. And the habits of that career, the logbook, the pre-run inspection, the maintenance schedule kept without prompting, because equipment that fails in a mountain snowstorm fails at the worst possible time, had followed him home the way professional habits follow people who were good at what they did. The property was 480 acres on the eastern foothills of the northern range, acquired by his father in 1961 when the land was cheap and the elevation was considered a liability rather than an asset. The main house sat at the property's center, a 1961 farmhouse that Walt had renovated incrementally over the decades since his return. New roof in 2011, new heating system in 2014, the kitchen rebuilt in 2018 with the same practical economy his father had brought to every improvement on the property. The equipment barn was 200 feet northwest of the house, a structure Walt had built in 2010 to house the plow rig, the tractor, and the maintenance inventory for both. It was insulated, wired for the block heater and hydraulic line warmers that kept the plow operational in temperatures that would seize an unprepared machine, and organized with the specific neatness of someone who knows that finding the right tool in the dark at 5 in the morning is not a luxury but a professional requirement. From the equipment barn's main door, looking east along the property's access road, you could see the Pinecrest Ridge Development's decorative stone entrance markers at a distance of approximately 400 feet. 2 cut stone pillars, a wrought iron arch between them with the development's name in cast letters, and a flagstone apron that the HOA's landscaping contractor maintained in the warmer months and that collected snow in the winter in exactly the decorative way the developer had intended. A clean, undisturbed white surface framing the entrance in a way that suggested exclusivity and careful upkeep. Walt passed those entrance markers every time he drove the service road. He had passed them 47 times in the most recent season alone, most passes at pre-dawn hours when the road needed clearing before residents needed to drive it. His plow truck's rear tires sometimes crossed the flagstone apron at the entrance's edge when he made the wide turn from the service road into the development's internal road system. Tire tracks in decorative snow. He had been making that same turn for 11 years and had left tire tracks in that snow cover every time the timing of his run coincided with a fresh surface. Nobody had mentioned the tire tracks for 11 years. In January of the current year, somebody mentioned them. He had started plowing the development's access road in the winter of 2014. The previous contractor, a local equipment operator named Cresswell, who had held the service agreement since the development opened in 2012, had quit in mid-February 2014, 3 days after a difficult overnight storm, citing equipment reliability issues and a rate dispute with the HOA's then president. The president had called every contractor within 20 miles. Walt was the 7th call. He was the only one who had the right rig for a 1.2-mile mountain access road at that elevation. A commercial-grade plow truck with a 12-foot blade, rear ballast, and the hydraulic capacity to move wet mountain snow without bogging on the road's 2 significant grades. He had agreed to finish the 2014 season on a handshake rate and had drafted a written service agreement the following October, when the HOA's president asked him to return for the full 2014 to 2015 season. The agreement was 1 page, 4 sections. Section 1. Service description. Snow removal on the Pinecrest Ridge access road from the county highway connection to the development's internal turnaround, a 1.2-mile service corridor, as needed following snowfall events, meeting or exceeding 3 inches at the road's midpoint elevation gauge. Section 2. Compensation. $4,200 per season, October through April inclusive, payable in 2 installments, October 1st and January 1st. Section 3. Service terms. Walt would provide service at his discretion and on his schedule, using his own equipment and fuel, without direction from the HOA regarding timing, routing within the service corridor, or equipment operation. Section 4. Termination. Either party may terminate the agreement with 7 days written notice, with no cause required, compensation prorated to the termination date. He had been the one to write those terms because he had spent 30 years on infrastructure contracts and knew what a service agreement needed to say to protect the service provider from operational interference. The discretion language in Section 3 was not boilerplate. It was the product of watching public works contractors get their service runs dictated by administrators who had never operated a plow rig and who did not understand that the sequence and timing of a snow removal operation on a mountain road was a professional judgment made in real time, based on conditions that changed by the hour. He had written Section 3 because he intended to run the service the way the service needed to be run, and he did not want to spend 11 years arguing about it. He renewed the agreement every October, signing at the kitchen table after reading it through to confirm that the terms were unchanged from the previous year's version. He kept every signed copy in the filing cabinet in the second bedroom, behind the tab labeled Pinecrest Ridge, Service Agreement. He also kept a service logbook, a bound record book, 1 entry per plowing run, with columns for date, departure time, road entry time, snow depth at the midpoint gauge, run completion time, and fuel consumption. The logbook went back to the 2014 to 2015 season's first entry and contained 47 entries for the most recent season through the date of the fine. Every entry was legible and dated. The column for missed runs was empty. The non-interference clause was not in the original 2014 agreement. He had added it in October 2016, after an incident the previous February in which a board member named Haddon had flagged Walt down during a pre-dawn run to tell him he should be plowing the development's interior loop roads before the access road, because the interior loop connected to the parking areas, and residents needed to reach their vehicles before they needed to reach the county highway. Walt had explained that the access road was the only way in or out, and that a clear access road was the precondition for everything else being useful. Haddon had insisted. Walt had finished the run in his own sequence and driven back to his property. The following October, he had added a 4th subsection to Section 3. The HOA, its board members, officers, agents, and residents shall not direct, restrict, schedule, or penalize the service provider's equipment operation or road access during the agreement's active term, and any attempt to do so shall constitute a material breach of this agreement. The HOA's then president had signed the amended agreement without comment. The non-interference clause had sat in Section 3 for 8 years, through 7 annual renewals, without anyone on the HOA's board reading it carefully enough to understand what it meant and what it would do if they violated it. Brenda Marsh had become board president in 2022. She had a background in regional sales management, organized, deadline-oriented, comfortable issuing directives and following up on them. She ran the HOA's operations with the efficiency of a person who had spent 20 years managing distributed teams and who had concluded that the gap between a directive and its execution was always a personnel problem. The Pinecrest Ridge access road had been clear every winter for 11 years. In Brenda's mental model of the development's operations, this was a community service, a line item in the HOA budget, a deliverable produced by the road maintenance and services fee that 140 units paid at $60 per year, a reliable outcome that she was responsible for maintaining. She did not think of it as Walt Greer's discretionary service, operated under a private bilateral agreement that he could terminate on 7 days' notice because he owned the equipment and the agreement said he could. She thought of it as snow removal, the same category as trash pickup or landscaping, a contracted service the HOA paid for and the HOA received. She had never read the service agreement. The HOA's administrative files contained the most recent signed copy, same as every year since 2014, filed in the board correspondence binder under Services, Snow Removal. Brenda had looked at the tab. She had not opened it. The fine was issued on a Tuesday in mid-January. 2 residents had emailed the board the previous weekend about tire tracks crossing the decorative snow cover at the entrance apron, the flagstone area between the entrance pillars that the landscaping contractor kept clear of debris in summer and that collected a pristine snow surface in winter, that the HOA's newsletter had described as one of the development's seasonal features. Walt's plow truck had made its standard pre-dawn run on Saturday morning. The wide turn from the service road into the development's internal road system, crossing the entrance apron's edge in the same arc it had crossed for 11 years, leaving 2 parallel tire tracks across the decorative surface. The residents had photographed it. Brenda had received the emails, reviewed the photographs, and checked the HOA's Community Aesthetics Code, which applied to contractors performing work within the development, and included a provision against equipment damage to common area surfaces. She had issued the fine on Tuesday, $400, payable within 14 days, citing Section 4.3 of the Aesthetics Code, contractor equipment damage to common area decorative surface. The fine letter arrived at Walt's mailbox Thursday afternoon. He brought it inside, set it on the kitchen table, and read it standing. He read it twice, once for the general substance and once for the specific authority it cited. Then he went to the second bedroom, pulled the service agreement from the filing cabinet, and brought it to the kitchen table. He read Section 3, Subsection 4, the non-interference clause, the same way he read every provision of every contract he had ever signed, as a statement of operational reality that he had put in writing because operational reality needed to be in writing to be enforceable. The clause said the HOA shall not penalize the service provider's equipment operation during the agreement's active term. The fine was a penalty for his equipment's operation during the agreement's active term. The clause was not ambiguous. The fine violated it. He went to the kitchen counter and called Nora. She answered on the second ring, the same reliable pickup she had maintained since her mother died in 2017, and she had decided that she would always answer her father's calls immediately, because the calls that seemed routine sometimes were not. He told her about the fine, $400, aesthetics code, tire tracks at the entrance. He told her he had checked the service agreement and found the non-interference clause. She asked one question: does the agreement have a termination clause? He picked up the agreement and read her Section 4. Either party may terminate the agreement with 7 days written notice, with no cause required, compensation prorated to the termination date. She was quiet for a moment, the same quality of quiet he had heard from Owen Pruitt in the legal contexts and from Ellis Roark in the survey contexts, the quiet of a professional, recognizing the governing provision immediately and understanding what it meant before she said anything about it. Then she said, "I'll drive up Saturday." He said the guest room was ready and the coffee would be on at 7. After they hung up, he sat at the kitchen table with the agreement in front of him and looked at Section 3, Subsection 4, 8 words in the operative sentence that he had written in October 2016 after a pre-dawn argument with a board member who had never operated a plow rig in his life. The HOA shall not penalize the service provider's equipment operation. He had written those words to describe a boundary. For 8 years, the boundary had sat in the agreement, unsigned and unread by the people who needed to understand it. Brenda Marsh had crossed it with a $400 fine for tire tracks in decorative snow. He opened his service logbook to the current week's pages and wrote Thursday's date in the margin. He wrote, "Fine received, $400, aesthetics code, entrance apron tire tracks. Non-interference clause, violated. Agreement status, under review. Nora arriving Saturday." He closed the logbook and looked out the kitchen window at the equipment barn. The plow truck was inside, backed in the way he always backed it, ready to pull out forward, the blade in transport position, the hydraulic lines warm. It had made 47 runs this season without missing one. It would make whatever number the rest of the season required. Whether it would make them on the Pinecrest Ridge service road depended on what Brenda Marsh decided to do next. He went to bed thinking about the termination clause, and did not find the thinking troubling. He had written it to be used if it needed to be used. Whether it needed to be used was not yet determined. Saturday was 2 days away. Pinecrest Ridge had been built on the premise that mountain living was a premium experience, and that the details of how that experience was maintained were someone else's problem. The developer, a regional residential builder named Crestview Group, had acquired the northern foothills parcel in 2009, when mountain parcels at that elevation were selling at a discount because the 2008 market correction had reset buyer appetite for anything that required a specialized access arrangement. Crestview had looked at the parcel and seen what the price correction had made available. A 340-acre development site with natural topography, timber framing views, and the kind of quiet that people who had spent 20 years in suburban developments were beginning to pay a premium for. The access issue, a 1.2-mile private road crossing an adjacent landowner's property, with no county maintenance designation and no existing winter service infrastructure, was noted in the development feasibility study as a detail to be addressed in the marketing framework. The 2011 marketing materials addressed it in 2 sentences on page 3 of the community brochure. Pinecrest Ridge offers year-round private road access, maintained by community services, providing residents with a secure and scenic approach to their mountain home. The phrase community services was doing significant work in that sentence. It implied an institutional arrangement, a funded, organized, reliable service structure managed by the community for its own benefit. What it described, in practical terms, was a single private operator with a commercial plow rig who lived 400 feet from the development's entrance and who had agreed in writing to provide snow removal on a seasonal basis. There was no county maintenance contract. There was no secondary contractor. There was no contingency plan for a winter in which the single private operator became unavailable. There was Walt Greer, a service agreement, and the understanding, never formalized, never verified, never examined by anyone who knew how to examine it, that Walt would keep the road open because he always had. The development had opened in late 2012, with 140 units sold over an 18-month period. The marketing had worked exactly as Crestview had designed it to work. Buyers at this elevation, in this price range, were purchasing a lifestyle and a setting, and the details of access maintenance were presented as part of the community's managed infrastructure. Several buyers had asked about winter road access during the sales process. The sales team had described the private road service as a community-managed amenity. Nobody had asked to see the service agreement. Nobody had asked who held the equipment or what the agreement's termination terms were. The road had been plowed reliably for 2 seasons under the previous contractor, Cresswell, before he quit in February 2014, and the seamless transition to Walt, who had the development clear again within 48 hours of Cresswell's departure, had reinforced the sense that the service was an institutional feature of the community, rather than a personal arrangement with a specific individual on a specific set of contractual terms. The HOA had formed in 2013 and had developed its operational framework from the documents Crestview had left behind. The CC and RS, the budget template, the vendor contract summaries. The snow removal line in the budget was labeled Road Maintenance and Services, Winter, and the fee structure had been established in 2013 at $60 per unit per year, producing $8,400 in annual revenue. Walt's $4,200 seasonal fee represented exactly half of that revenue. The other $4,200 went to the HOA's administrative overhead account, described in the budget as Road Maintenance Management and Coordination. What Road Maintenance Management and Coordination meant in practice was that the HOA's president received Walt's service completion notifications, which he sent by text after each run, a habit he had established in the first season and maintained because it closed the loop on each service event without requiring a phone call, and filed the January installment payment check. The coordination was minimal because Walt ran the service without requiring coordination. 3 successive board presidents had treated the snow removal arrangement as a fixed feature of the development's infrastructure. None of them had read the service agreement with the attention its terms required. None of them had asked what would happen if Walt's agreement was terminated. None of them had established a backup contractor relationship or inquired about county maintenance options. The road had been clear every winter for 11 years. The assumption that it would continue to be clear was so thoroughly embedded in the development's operational framework that it had ceased to function as an assumption and had become, in the minds of everyone responsible for the community's management, a fact. Brenda Marsh had held that assumption in a particularly concentrated form. She had moved into Pinecrest Ridge in 2013, the development's first full winter, and had watched the road clear itself after every significant snowfall with the same reliability that the county highway at the road's far end was cleared by the county's own equipment. She had become board president in 2022 and had managed the development's snow removal line item with the confidence of someone who has never had a reason to look behind the line item and find out what was actually producing the result. The road cleared, the fee collected, Walt's text arrived. The January check was written. This was the full extent of Brenda's operational relationship with the snow removal arrangement, and it had given her no reason to think the arrangement had a vulnerability. The tire track complaint arrived on a Saturday afternoon in mid-January. 2 emails, sent within an hour of each other, from residents on the development's northern loop who had photographed the entrance apron after Walt's pre-dawn run. The flagstone surface between the entrance pillars, which had been covered in an unmarked snow layer since the previous Tuesday's light snowfall, showed 2 parallel tire tracks crossing its eastern edge. Walt's rear axle arc on the wide turn from the service road into the development's internal road system, the same arc he had made on the same surface under similar conditions dozens of times over 11 seasons. The photographs were clear and the tracks were visible. Both emails described the tracks as unsightly and asked the board to address it with the snow removal contractor. Brenda had received the emails on her phone that afternoon, reviewed the photographs, and decided within 20 minutes that this was an aesthetics enforcement matter. The HOA's Community Aesthetics Code had been updated in 2020 to include a section on contractor operations, Section 4.3, which addressed equipment damage to common area surfaces by contractors performing work within the development. The section had been written with landscaping contractors in mind, specifically after an incident in which a lawn service operator had damaged the entrance apron's flagstone during a summer edging operation. Brenda read Section 4.3 and found it applicable to the current situation. Contractor equipment had damaged a common area decorative surface. The code's enforcement mechanism was a fine of up to $500 per incident. She set it at $400. She had drafted the fine letter Sunday evening and had circulated it to the board for co-signature Monday morning. The board had 3 members besides Brenda, a retired school administrator named Holt, who co-signed everything without question, a software project manager named Vesper, who had been on the board for 2 months and who co-signed after a brief exchange with Brenda, confirming that the aesthetics code citation was correct, and Delia Sorn. Delia had been on the board for 18 months. She was a former municipal budget analyst, the kind of professional who spent her working life reading service contracts and identifying the gap between what a document said and what an administrator believed it said. She had been managing the HOA's budget review process since joining the board and had opened the snow removal services file once, in her first month, to confirm the fee structure and payment schedule. She had not read the service agreement at that time. She had noted the filing location and moved on. When the fine letter draft arrived in her inbox Monday morning, she read it and wrote to Brenda before she co-signed. She asked whether levying a charge against a contracted service provider was consistent with the terms of the service agreement. She said she wanted to confirm the Aesthetics Code Enforcement Authority extended to contractors operating under a separate bilateral agreement before she signed. She said she would check the agreement herself and co-sign once she had confirmed there was no conflict. Brenda called her back within 15 minutes and said the aesthetics code applied to all contractors operating within the development, that this was standard HOA enforcement authority, and that the fine letter needed to go out today. She said the code was clear, and the photographs documented the damage. She said Delia should sign. Delia said she would read the agreement first. Brenda said the agreement was a standard service contract, and the aesthetics code superseded it on matters of community standards. Delia said she would still read it. She went to the HOA's administrative files that evening, the board correspondence binder, the tab labeled Services, Snow Removal, and pulled the current signed service agreement. She read it at her kitchen table, 4 sections, 1 page. She read Section 1 and Section 2 without stopping. She slowed at Section 3 and read it twice. She stopped at subsection 4, the non-interference clause, and read it 3 times. The HOA, its board members, officers, agents, and residents shall not direct, restrict, schedule, or penalize the service provider's equipment operation or road access during the agreement's active term, and any attempt to do so shall constitute a material breach of this agreement. She set the agreement down. She looked at the fine letter draft on her laptop screen. The fine letter was a penalty for the service provider's equipment operation during the agreement's active term. The non-interference clause called that a material breach. She read the clause a 4th time to confirm she had not misread it. She had not. She did not co-sign the fine letter. She emailed Brenda that evening. She had read the service agreement and found a non-interference clause in Section 3, subsection 4, that appeared to prohibit penalizing the service provider's equipment operation. She attached a photograph of the relevant clause from the agreement. She asked Brenda to confirm whether the fine was consistent with that provision before it was sent. Brenda received the email at 9:15 p.m. and did not reply. The fine letter went out Tuesday under Brenda's signature, Holt's co-signature, and Vesper's co-signature. Delia's name was not on it. Walt received it Thursday. He read it at the kitchen table, checked the agreement, called Nora. She asked if there was a termination clause. He read it to her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she would drive up Saturday. Delia had printed her email to Brenda and kept it in a folder she had started the previous evening, after she read the non-interference clause. The folder had 2 items in it, the printed email with its sent timestamp and the absence of any reply, and a handwritten note she had made while reading Section 4 of the agreement. The note said, 7 days written notice, no cause required, and below it, underlined once, either party. She kept the folder on her desk. She was waiting to see what Walt would do and what Brenda would say when Walt did it. She had read the termination clause clearly enough to understand that the sequence of events the fine had set in motion was not going to resolve in the HOA's favor. The only question was how long it would take for that to become apparent to everyone else. She looked out her living room window at the development's access road, clear and well-maintained in the January cold, and thought about what the road looked like after 18 inches of overnight snow when there was no plow truck scheduled to come. She closed the folder, put it in her bag, and went to bed. Outside, Walt's equipment barn was locked for the night, the plow truck inside with its block heater running, hydraulic lines warm, blade in transport position. It had cleared that road 47 times this season. Whether it cleared it a 48th time was a question that Brenda Marsh had answered with a $400 fine for tire tracks in decorative snow. And Delia Sorn, sitting with the non-interference clause and the termination clause in a folder on her desk, already knew what the answer meant. Nora arrived Saturday at 8:30, earlier than she had said she would. The drive from the state capitol completed in the pre-dawn quiet of a January morning, when the highway was salted and clear, and the thinking time was uninterrupted. She had been thinking about the service agreement since Thursday evening, not anxiously, but in the methodical way she approached every contracts question, from the operative language outward, following the clause structure in the direction the document pointed. A non-interference clause and a termination clause in the same agreement were not unusual in isolation. Together, in the context of a $400 fine for tire tracks, they were a sequence. She wanted to sit with the full file and confirm that the sequence ran the way she thought it ran. Walt met her at the door with coffee. They sat at the kitchen table for 15 minutes. The herd, the timber stand's winter condition, the equipment maintenance schedule he had run through in December. He mentioned the plow truck was in perfect working order, serviced in October the same as every year. The hydraulic lines warm and the blade mechanism cycling correctly. He said it as a statement of fact. the way he noted everything about his equipment. Not with pride, but with the flat accuracy of a man who knew that the condition of his equipment was a professional matter, and that professional matters were maintained or they were not. Nora noted it and said nothing yet. She took her coffee to the second bedroom at 9 o'clock. Walt had left the service file on the table, the full contents in order. Current signed agreement at the front, 11 years of renewal copies behind it in chronological sequence, the logbook for the current season flagged at the entry pages, the HOA's fee structure document from the annual financial disclosure, and Brenda's fine letter at the back. Nora sat down and read from the beginning. She read the current agreement first, 1 page, 4 sections, the October renewal date on the signature line, Walt's signature below it, and Brenda's above it. She read section 1 and 2 for context. She slowed at section 3 and read each subsection in sequence. Subsection 4, the non-interference clause, she read 3 times, the same way she read any operative provision that was going to be the center of a dispute, once for comprehension, once to identify every word that carried legal weight, and once to confirm that she had not introduced an interpretation that the language itself did not support. The HOA, its board members, officers, agents, and residents shall not direct, restrict, schedule, or penalize the service provider's equipment operation or road access during the agreement's active term, and any attempt to do so shall constitute a material breach of this agreement. She wrote it in her notepad, word for word, not because she needed to transcribe it, but because writing legal language by hand was her way of confirming that she had processed every word rather than skimmed past anything. She underlined penalize. She underlined material breach. She drew a line from penalize to the fine letter at the back of the file and wrote, $400 fine equals penalty for equipment operation equals direct violation. She read section 4, the termination clause, the same way. Either party may terminate the agreement with 7 days written notice, with no cause required. Compensation prorated to the termination date. She wrote it in her notepad below the non-interference clause. She underlined no cause required. She underlined either party. She wrote below it breach notice first, then termination if retraction refused. She read the 11 years of renewal copies next, every October signature page. Waltz in the same steady hand each year. The HOA president's signature changing 4 times over the period as the board presidency had turned over. She noted the 2016 amendment, the October renewal that first introduced the non-interference clause, the agreement 1 page with a handwritten addition in section 3 initialed by both parties. Walt had told her about the 2016 incident on the phone Thursday evening. The board member who had flagged him down mid-run to redirect his sequence. She looked at the initialed addition and understood exactly what had produced it. A man with 30 years of infrastructure operations experience writing a clause to describe a boundary that common sense had not been sufficient to maintain. She read the HOA's fee structure document, $60 per unit, 140 units, $8,400 per year beginning 2013. The snow removal line labeled road maintenance and services. Winter. She calculated Walt's share, $4,200, exactly half. She noted the HOA's retained $4,200, described as road maintenance management and coordination. She wrote in her notepad, HOA retains 50% of fee revenue for managing a service they do not operate and have no authority to direct, under the same agreement that removes them from operational control. She read Brenda's fine letter last. Section 4.3 of the Community Aesthetics Code. Contractor equipment damage to common area decorative surface. $400, payable within 14 days. She set it down and looked at her notes. The non-interference clause on the first page of her notepad. The termination clause below it. The $400 figure at the bottom. She came back to the kitchen table at noon and called Owen Pruitt. Owen had spent 25 years in agricultural services and private contract law. The first aide as counsel for the County Public Works Department, a background that meant he read service agreements with the institutional fluency of someone who had drafted and enforced them from the government side before moving to private practice. He understood bilateral service contracts the way field surveyors understood easement instruments, not as documents to be summarized, but as operational frameworks whose every clause had a purpose and whose purposes interlocked in ways that determined what was possible and what was not. Nora had worked with him in 2 contracts matters and had sent 3 clients to him since. She trusted his reading of service agreement language specifically and his understanding of HOA enforcement authority in relation to independent contractors generally. She gave him the summary in 8 minutes. He asked 4 questions: the year the non-interference clause was added and the circumstances that prompted it, whether the HOA's aesthetics code had been adopted before or after the service agreement was first executed, whether the fine letter cited the aesthetics code as the sole authority or also referenced the service agreement, and whether Walt had received any courtesy notice about the tire tracks before the formal fine was issued. The answers were 2016, prompted by board member interference with a service run. The aesthetics code's current version, including section 4.3, was adopted in 2020, 6 years after the service agreement. The fine letter cited only the aesthetics code, with no reference to the service agreement, and no courtesy notice of any kind had been issued before the formal fine. Owen said he would review the HOA's full governing documents alongside the service agreement and call back by the following Thursday. He asked Nora to scan and send the complete file, all renewal copies, the logbook current season pages, the fee structure document, and the fine letter. She said she would. He asked one additional question. Did the service agreement contain any provision giving the HOA's governing documents precedence over the agreement's terms in the event of a conflict? She checked. No precedence clause. Owen said that was what he expected. She spent the afternoon at the kitchen table with the scanner, every renewal copy, the logbook's current season pages, the fee structure document, Walt's pre-dawn run text log from his phone showing 47 completion notifications sent to the HOA president over the current season, and the fine letter. She organized the scan with a cover sheet, document list, key clause locations, the non-interference clause and termination clause, transcribed at the top, where Owen would see them before he opened anything else. Walt sat at the other end of the table with the season's cattle management records, reviewing the winter feeding schedule with the same unhurried attention he brought to everything. They worked in the same room through the afternoon without needing to discuss what the other was doing. He had watched Nora work since she was a child, and she had watched him work since before that, and the shared rhythm of 2 people who trusted each other's competence was one they had long since stopped needing to establish. Owen called the following Thursday at 2 in the afternoon. Walt and Nora were on speaker at the kitchen table. Owen reported his findings in 3 parts. The first part addressed the fine's legal validity. The fine was a direct and unambiguous violation of the non-interference clause in Section 3, subsection 4 of the service agreement. The HOA's aesthetics code did not supersede the service agreement for one fundamental reason. Walt was not a contractor operating under an HOA contract. He was a party to a bilateral service agreement, a private contract between 2 parties with equal standing, and that agreement's terms governed his operational relationship with the HOA for the duration of the active term. The aesthetics code applied to resident behavior and to third-party vendors working under HOA-issued contracts, where the HOA was the contracting authority, and the vendor operated within the HOA's governance framework. Walt was neither a resident nor an HOA contracted vendor. He operated under his own agreement, which he had negotiated, which he had amended in 2016 to add the non-interference clause, and which the HOA's then president had signed. The fine was a penalty for his equipment's normal service operation. The non-interference clause said that was a material breach. The aesthetics code's adoption in 2020, 6 years after the agreement's first execution, did not modify the agreement's terms and could not be applied retroactively to an agreement the HOA had signed without a precedence clause. The second part addressed the fee structure. The HOA's $8,400 annual collection, labeled Road Maintenance and Services, winter was, in operational terms, a repackaging of Walt's private service as a community amenity. The fee implied to residents that the HOA managed and controlled the snow removal service, that it was a community institution rather than a personal arrangement with a specific contractor on specific contractual terms. The fee structure had never been disclosed to Walt as such. He had never been asked to represent his service as a community amenity or to subordinate his agreement's termination rights to the HOA's operational continuity needs. The fee was a financial representation to 140 units about a service that the agreement's termination clause allowed to disappear on 7 days' notice. Owen noted this not as a claim, but as a factual description of the gap between what residents had been told and what the agreement actually provided. The third part was the termination clause, and Owen described it the way he described any provision that was both legally significant and operationally immediate. Section 4 was plain. 7 days written notice, no cause required, compensation prorated. The clause required nothing beyond the notice itself. No negotiation, no administrative process, no finding of cause or fault. It was a bilateral right, available to either party, exercisable at will. Owen said his recommendation was to send a breach notice first, a formal written demand for retraction of the fine, and confirmation that no further fines would be issued under the Aesthetics Code or any other HOA authority for Walt's Equipment's normal service operation. If Brenda's response retracted the fine, the matter was resolved without termination. If Brenda's response refused retraction, the breach was confirmed and the termination notice was the appropriate remedy. He said the breach notice should give Brenda 7 days to respond. He said he would draft it over the weekend and have it to Walt by Monday. He also said he had called Garrett Ohl the previous Monday, a state-certified equipment and road services contractor with 18 years of mountain operations experience, to perform a road service impact assessment. He wanted the assessment completed before the termination notice went out, so that the full picture of what termination meant in operational terms was documented in a professional report rather than estimated. He said Garrett's preliminary findings were consistent with what he had expected. No alternative contractor within 25 miles maintained mountain-grade plow equipment appropriate for the road's elevation and grade profile. Emergency mobilization time for the nearest qualifying contractor was 4 to 6 hours minimum. Cost per plowing event at mountain elevation rates was $3,200 with a 4-hour minimum call-out, no seasonal retainer available on short notice. Nora said she had expected those numbers. Owen said, "So did I." He said the assessment would be in a sealed report by the following week. He said the numbers did not change the legal analysis, but that having them in a professional document before the termination notice was sent was the correct sequence. Documented reality first, then notice. Walt had been listening without speaking. He asked one question. If Brenda refused to retract the fine and he sent the termination notice, was there any legal risk to him in terminating a service that the development had no backup for? Owen said, no. The agreement was a private bilateral contract. The termination clause was explicit and unconditional. Walt's legal obligation to the development was the obligation he had accepted in the service agreement and nothing beyond it. There was no public service designation, no county obligation, no recorded instrument that made his plowing service a community right. His legal exposure for terminating a private service agreement with 7 days' notice was zero. Whatever happened to the development's road access after termination was a consequence of the HOA's failure to maintain a backup arrangement, not a consequence of Walt's lawful exercise of his contractual right. Walt said, all right. He said he would wait for the breach notice draft Monday and would review it the same day. Owen said he would send it before noon. Delia Sorn had not received a reply to her email in the 10 days since she had sent it. She had waited 5 days after the fine letter went out, then sent a follow-up, a single sentence, confirming that her question about the non-interference clause was still open, asking whether Brenda had reviewed the provision before issuing the fine. No reply. She had waited 3 more days and sent a second follow-up, 1 sentence. She wanted to discuss the service agreement's terms before the board's next meeting. No reply. She had printed all 3 emails, the original with its attachment photograph of the non-interference clause, and both follow-ups, and added them to the folder on her desk. Then she had gone back to the service agreement and read Section 4 again. 7 days written notice, no cause required, either party. She had written those 2 lines in her notebook the night she first read the clause. She looked at them again Thursday evening, after the 3rd unanswered email. She underlined either party a second time. Then below it, in smaller letters, she wrote, no backup contractor, no county service, elevation, impassable without a plow. She looked at what she had written. She looked out the window at the development's access road, clear and well-maintained in the January cold. She closed the notebook, put it in her bag with the folder, and went to bed. Owen sent the breach notice draft Monday morning at 11:40. 2 paragraphs, plain language, the structure of a contracts attorney who had spent 25 years writing documents that said exactly what they needed to say and nothing additional. The first paragraph identified the violation. The HOA's fine letter dated the previous Tuesday, citing Section 4.3 of the Community Aesthetics Code and levying a $400 charge against Walt for his plow truck's tire contact with the entrance apron during a scheduled service run, constituted a penalty for the service provider's equipment operation during the agreement's active term. Section 3, subsection 4 of the service agreement, signed by both parties at the most recent October renewal, explicitly prohibited the HOA from penalizing the service provider's equipment operation during the active term, and identified any such attempt as a material breach of the agreement. The fine was a direct violation of that provision. The second paragraph stated the demand. Walt required written retraction of the fine within 7 days of the breach notice's certified delivery date, together with written confirmation that no further fines, assessments, or charges would be issued under the Aesthetics Code or any other HOA authority for his equipment's normal service operation during the current or any subsequent agreement term. If the HOA failed to provide written retraction and confirmation within 7 days, Walt reserved all rights available to him under the agreement and at law, including but not limited to the termination rights set forth in Section 4. Nora read it at the kitchen table and called Owen with 2 observations, both about the final sentence. She said the phrase, including but not limited to, was standard, but that in this specific context, where the termination clause was the operative remedy, she would prefer a direct citation. The rights set forth in Section 4 of the service agreement, specifically. Owen agreed and revised it. The revised draft arrived in Walt's email at noon. Walt printed it, read it from the first word to the last, and said it was accurate. He signed it, scanned it to Owen's office, and drove to the County Road Post Office at 1:15. He mailed it certified. He kept the receipt, drove back to the property, and ran his Monday afternoon equipment check, plow blade hydraulics, tire pressure, block heater thermostat, before coming inside. He opened his service logbook to the current week's page and wrote, "Breach notice mailed 1:15 p.m. Monday, 7-day retraction window, running. Agreement status, material breach by HOA. Retraction required by, date 7 days from certified delivery." He closed the logbook and looked out the equipment barn window at the access road, running east from his property line toward the county highway. Clear and packed from the previous Saturday's service run, he had plowed it at 4:30 a.m., 18-degree temperature, 6 inches of overnight accumulation. The run completed in 51 minutes at the pace the road's 2 grades required in those conditions. The road was clear. It would need attention again by the end of the week if the forecast held. He would assess the forecast on Thursday. Whether he acted on it depended on what Brenda Marsh decided to do with the breach notice. Brenda received the certified envelope Wednesday at 11 a.m. She signed the receipt at her front door and carried it to the kitchen table. She read the first paragraph once and set the letter down. She looked at the non-interference clause citation, Section 3, subsection 4, and felt the specific discomfort of reading a legal provision that named the thing she had done in language that did not allow for interpretation. She picked the letter back up and read the second paragraph. Retraction and confirmation within 7 days. Section 4 rights reserved. She called the HOA's general counsel at 11:20. The attorney who answered listened to her description for 3 minutes and told her that bilateral service contract disputes were outside his firm's standard scope. He handled the development's governance and collections matters, not third-party contract enforcement questions. He gave her 2 referral names. She wrote them down and called the first one before she had finished writing the second. The contract's attorney's paralegal said he could review the file and call back by Thursday. Brenda sent the breach notice and the service agreement by email that afternoon. She sent only those 2 documents. She did not send the HOA's aesthetics code because she was confident the code's authority was self-evident. She did not send the HOA's fee structure documentation. The attorney called back Thursday at 1 in the afternoon, a day earlier than expected. He had read the service agreement and the breach notice in full and had looked up the HOA's aesthetics code through the county's public HOA filings. He said the non-interference clause was unambiguous. He said it had been in the agreement since 2016 and had been renewed annually, including at the most recent October renewal, with Brenda's own signature on the signature line. He said the clause explicitly prohibited penalizing the service provider's equipment operation and explicitly defined any such attempt as a material breach. He said the fine was a penalty for the service provider's equipment operation. He said the Aesthetics Code Section 4.3 could not supersede the service agreement's non-interference clause because the service agreement was a bilateral contract with equal standing to any HOA governance document, and the agreement contained no precedence clause, giving HOA documents priority in the event of a conflict. He said the correct response to the breach notice was retraction of the fine. He said if she did not retract, Walt would terminate. He had read Section 4, 7 days, no cause required. Brenda asked if there was a legal argument that the Aesthetics Code applied regardless of the service agreement's non-interference clause, an argument that the HOA's authority over its own common areas superseded a private contract's operational protections. The attorney said there was not a viable one. He said the non-interference clause had been written specifically to address the HOA's authority over common area operations during the service run, and the clause's language covered exactly that scenario. He said the clause existed in the agreement because something had happened in 2016 that had caused the service provider to add it, and if that incident was the kind of interference the clause was written to prevent, then the fine was precisely the kind of violation the clause was written to capture. Brenda thanked him. She told him she would be in touch. She hung up and sat at the kitchen table with the breach notice and the service agreement and the contract's attorney's assessment running in her head. She thought about the tire track photographs. She thought about the 2 residents who had emailed. She thought about what retracting the fine would look like to those 2 residents and to the 138 others who would hear about it. A board president reversing an aesthetics enforcement action because a contractor had claimed a contractual exemption. She thought about what that precedent meant for the HOA's enforcement authority going forward. She did not think about what parking the plow would mean for the development's access road. The road had been clear for 11 years. It would be clear next week. The service was a community institution. The contractor would come around. She called the fine letters template up on her laptop and drafted a response. 2 paragraphs. The fine stood. Payment was due within 14 days. The Community Aesthetics Code applied to all parties operating within the development, and the HOA's authority to enforce community standards was not subject to individual contractor contract terms. The HOA considered the matter settled and expected payment by the stated deadline. She did not send it to the contract's attorney for review. She sent it to Walt directly, by email and certified mail, Thursday afternoon. Walt received the email Thursday evening. He read it once and called Nora. She answered immediately. He read her both paragraphs. She said, "Send the termination notice." He said he had expected she would say that. She said she would call Owen now and have the draft to him tonight. He said all right. Owen drafted the termination notice in 40 minutes. 1 page, 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph referenced the breach notice, its delivery date, and the 7-day retraction window that had been provided. The second paragraph stated that the HOA's written response had refused retraction, confirmed the fine's enforcement, and constituted confirmation of the material breach identified in the breach notice. In accordance with Section 4 of the service agreement, Walt hereby provided 7 days written notice of termination. The agreement would terminate at the close of the 7th day from the notice's certified delivery date. All service obligations under the agreement would conclude at termination. Equipment would be withdrawn from the service corridor at the termination date. The third paragraph noted the proration calculation. The remaining season compensation from the termination date through April 30th was $2,800, which the HOA owed Walt for the portion of the term elapsed before termination, payable within 30 days of the termination date. Owen sent it to Nora at 9:15 p.m. She read it, confirmed it was accurate, called Walt, and read it to him over the phone. He said it was correct. She said she would send it back to Owen for execution. Owen sent the final version to Walt's email at 10:05. Walt printed it at the kitchen table, signed it, put it in an envelope, and drove to the County Road Post Office at 10:45. He mailed it certified. Friday evening, the post office clerk stamping the envelope's certification number with the same mechanical efficiency the post office applied to every piece of outgoing mail, regardless of what it meant to the person sending it. Walt drove back to the property in the dark. He sat at the kitchen table and opened his logbook. He wrote Friday's date. He wrote, breach notice sent Monday. HOA refused retraction Thursday. Termination notice mailed Friday, 10:45 p.m. 7-day clock running from certified delivery. Last service date, 7 days from delivery. Agreement terminated at close of notice period. Equipment withdrawn from service at termination. He paused. He looked at the logbook entry for a moment. The sequence of it, the clean cause and effect progression from the $400 fine to the breach notice, to the refused retraction, to the termination notice, each event producing the next with the inevitability of a correctly functioning mechanism. Then he wrote the last line of the entry. Plow barn, locked at termination. He closed the logbook. Garrett Oles' sealed impact assessment arrived at Owen's office Friday morning, the same day the termination notice was being drafted. 17 pages, Garrett's state contractor certification seal on the cover page, his signature on the assessment certification at the back. Owen read it before noon and called Nora. He read her the key findings. Section 1 described the access road's physical characteristics. A 1.2-mile private road at an average elevation of 4,200 feet, with 2 grades of 8% and 11%, requiring a commercial-grade plow with a minimum 12-foot blade and rear ballast to operate safely on the steeper grade in wet snow conditions. The road's geometry and elevation placed it in the category of mountain-grade infrastructure that standard residential plow contractors, the kind typically serving lower elevation developments, were not equipped or certified to service. Section 2 was the alternative contractor analysis. Garrett had contacted every plow contractor registered with the state's contractor database within a 35-mile service radius of the Pinecrest Ridge address. 3 contractors in the database listed mountain elevation service as part of their operational range. He had called all 3. One had retired in the fall and was no longer operating. One was already contracted to capacity for the current season and was not accepting new clients. The third could provide emergency service on an event-by-event basis at a 4-hour minimum mobilization time, no seasonal retainer available, at a rate of $3,200 per event. No contractor within the service area maintained the equipment or the seasonal availability to replace Walt's agreement on comparable terms. Section 3 was the storm frequency projection. Using the previous 5 years of regional snowfall data for the road's elevation band, Garrett projected 8 to 12 significant snowfall events, accumulations of 3 inches or more at the road's midpoint gauge, remaining in the current season between the potential termination date and April 30th. At $3,200 per event, emergency contractor costs for the remaining season ranged from $25,600 to $38,400. Walt's prorated remaining agreement fee was $2,800. Owen read that last comparison to Nora without editorial comment. She said she had expected the numbers to be significant. He said they were. He said the report would be a useful document in the event the matter proceeded to a formal proceeding. She said she understood. She said she would call him Monday after the termination notice's delivery was confirmed. Walt ran one final service on the Pinecrest Ridge Road the following Wednesday morning, the last run before the termination date, a standard pre-dawn run after 4 inches of overnight accumulation, the same sequence he had run 47 times before it that season. He drove down at 4:15 a.m., ran the 1.2 miles from the county highway connection to the development's turnaround and back, packed the road surface to its standard operating condition, and drove back to his property. He texted the completion notification to the HOA board's contact number at 5:02 a.m., the same text he had sent after every run for 11 seasons. Road clear, date time. He did not add anything to the text. It said what it had always said. He drove back to the equipment barn, backed the plow truck in, closed the barn door, and wrote the run in his logbook. Then he wrote one line below the entry. Final service run completed. Termination date, 2 days. Equipment, operational and maintained. He went inside and made breakfast. Outside the kitchen window, the access road was clear, packed, and running east to the county highway in the early January dark. It would stay clear for 2 days. After that, it would stay clear as long as the weather held. The forecast showed a front arriving in 72 hours. Brenda received the termination notice's certified envelope Monday morning. She signed the receipt at the door, carried it to the kitchen table, and read it standing. 3 paragraphs. Breach notice referenced. Retraction refused. 7 days written notice of termination. Agreement concluded at the close of the notice period. Equipment withdrawn from service at termination. Prorated remaining season fee of $2,800, payable within 30 days. She read the second paragraph twice. The one that said all service obligations under the agreement would conclude at termination. She looked at the word conclude. She had been board president for 3 years and had managed the development's snow removal line item for 3 winters without once thinking about what the line item looked like if it stopped. The road cleared, the fee collected, Walt's text arrived. These things had happened in sequence for 11 years, and the sequence had the quality of a physical law, not a contractual arrangement between 2 parties, one of whom had just invoked a termination clause, but a feature of the mountain and the road and the winter that would continue because it had always continued. She put the letter down and called the county road maintenance office. Ray Finch had been the county road maintenance supervisor for 22 years. He answered his own phone on the second ring, a habit from his years on the infrastructure committee, when the phone call that came at 7 a.m. was sometimes the one that mattered most. Brenda introduced herself and described the situation. She managed the homeowners association at Pinecrest Ridge, the development accessible via the private road at the eastern foothills approach, and she was inquiring about county snow removal service for the access road. Ray said, "The private road on the Greer property." She said yes. He said the road had no county maintenance designation. He said it had never had one. It was a private road on private property, and had been since the development was built. He said the county's equipment assignment for that elevation corridor covered the county highway at the road's western end and stopped there. He said the county had no obligation to plow a private access road, and no equipment or personnel assigned to do so. He said if she needed snow removal for a private road at that elevation, she should contact a private contractor. She asked if there was a process to establish a county maintenance designation for the road. He said there was a process, but that it involved a formal road dedication. The road would need to be conveyed to the county as a public right-of-way, which required the adjacent landowner's consent and a county engineering review. He said the process took a minimum of 18 months, and that even if initiated today, it would not produce a county maintenance obligation this season. He said he was sorry he could not be more helpful. She thanked him and hung up. She called 3 contractors from a web search. The first said they did not service roads above 3,500 feet. Their equipment was rated for lower elevation grades, and the insurance requirements for mountain grade service were beyond their current coverage. The second said they were contracted to capacity for the current season and were not accepting new clients. The third was Garrett Oll's name from the county contractor database. She did not know it was Garrett Oll, did not know he had already produced a sealed report describing the conversation she was about to have. He quoted $3,200 per event, 4-hour minimum call-out, no seasonal retainer available on short notice. He said if she called at 2 a.m. after an overnight storm, he would be there by 6, weather permitting. She wrote $3,200 on her notepad. She looked at it. She wrote $4,200 beside it, Walt's annual season fee. She looked at both numbers. Then she called an emergency board meeting. The common room, Thursday evening. Brenda, Delia, Holt, and Vesper in the 4 board chairs. Brenda had printed one document for the table, the 2-month service completion log showing Walt's 47 text notifications over the current world. Brenda received the certified termination notice Saturday morning. She signed the receipt at the door, brought it inside, and read it at the kitchen table. She read all 3 paragraphs. She read the termination date, 7 days from certified delivery, which placed it the following Saturday. And she read the proration calculation at the bottom, $2,800 owed to Walt for the elapsed portion of the term. She set the letter down and looked at it for a moment. Then she called the county road maintenance office. Ray Finch answered at his desk. He was a county road maintenance supervisor with 22 years of service, and the specific institutional knowledge of someone who had spent 2 decades knowing exactly which roads the county maintained and which ones it did not. He recognized the Pinecrest Ridge address before Brenda finished her second sentence. He said the road was private. He said it had always been private. He said it had no county maintenance designation of any kind, no plow contract, no seasonal service allocation, no equipment assignment for that elevation corridor. He said the county's mountain plow routes had been set in 1998 and last revised in 2009, and the Pinecrest Ridge access road had not appeared on either version because it was private property, with no public maintenance obligation. Brenda asked if the county could provide emergency snow removal service for a private road serving 140 residential units. Ray said no. He said the county's equipment was allocated to county-maintained roads, and that deploying county equipment on a private road would require a formal public benefit designation, a Board of Supervisors resolution, and an intergovernmental service agreement, a process that took months, not days. He said if she needed emergency plowing, she should contact a private contractor. He gave her the state contractor database's public access number. He said he was sorry he couldn't be more helpful, and he meant it, in the way that county employees mean it when they deliver accurate information that the recipient was hoping was wrong. She called 3 private contractors from the database after she hung up with Ray. The first said their equipment was rated for elevations up to 3,800 feet, and the road's midpoint gauge elevation was 4,200 feet, outside their operational range. They could not service it safely. The second said the same thing in different words. Their plow rigs were configured for valley and foothill work, and the grade profile on a mountain access road at that elevation required a different ballast and blade setup than they ran. They were not equipped for it. The third contractor, the one Garrett Ohl had identified in his sealed report as the only available option, quoted $3,200 per event, 4-hour minimum call-out from the time of the call, no seasonal retainer available on the current season's timeline. She asked if they could provide service starting the following week. They said they could if she called by event, paid in advance per call, and understood that the 4-hour mobilization window was a minimum, not a guarantee, depending on their existing call queue. She sat at the kitchen table with the termination notice and 3 contractor call notes and looked at the numbers. $3,200 per event. Garrett's sealed report, which she did not yet know existed in that form, but whose conclusions the 3 contractor calls had just independently confirmed, projected 8 to 12 events in the remaining season. She did not calculate the full season cost. She was not yet thinking in those terms. She was thinking about the emergency board meeting she needed to call, and the position she was going to take at it, and the letter she was going to send Walt, demanding he rescind the termination and return to service. She called the emergency board meeting for Thursday evening. The common room, the same 4 chairs. Brenda, Holt, Vesper, and Delia arrived within 10 minutes of each other. Brenda had prepared one document for the table, a timeline she had typed that afternoon showing the tire track complaint, the fine letter, the breach notice, and the termination notice in sequence, with the termination date noted at the bottom. She had not printed the service agreement. She had not printed the non-interference clause. She had not printed the contract's attorney's assessment from the previous week, the one she had dismissed after he told her retraction was the correct response. She presented her position in 12 minutes. The fine had been a valid aesthetics enforcement action under Section 4.3 of the Community Aesthetics Code, applied to a contractor operating within the development's common area. The HOA's authority to enforce community standards was an established governance right that no bilateral contractor agreement could fully supersede. Walt's termination notice was a pressure tactic, an attempt to coerce the board into withdrawing a valid enforcement action by threatening service interruption. The board's correct response was to hold its position, demonstrate that the HOA's enforcement authority was not negotiable, and send a formal letter demanding that Walt rescind the termination notice and resume service. If he refused to resume service, the HOA would pursue legal action for breach of community service obligations. Holt voted yes. He had not asked any questions. Vesper voted yes. He had been on the board for 2 months and had read the timeline document, but not the service agreement. Delia voted no. She said it clearly when the vote was called. Then she asked for the meeting minutes and the minute-taker's laptop. She had come to the meeting with her folder, the non-interference clause photograph, the 3 unanswered emails printed with their timestamps, and a handwritten note summarizing the termination clause that she had made 2 weeks earlier. She had been waiting for this meeting since the day she read the non-interference clause and understood where the sequence was going. She dictated her dissent directly to the minute-taker's screen, watching each sentence appear as she said it. She said she had voted no for 3 reasons, all documented. The first reason, before co-signing the fine letter, she had emailed Brenda asking whether levying a charge against the contracted service provider was consistent with the service agreement's terms, and had attached a photograph of the non-interference clause from the agreement, and had received no reply. She had sent 2 follow-up emails on subsequent days, asking the same question, and received no reply to either. The question had been the correct question, and it had been asked in writing before the fine went out, and it had not been answered. The second reason, she had read the service agreement herself and found Section 3, subsection 4, which prohibited the HOA from penalizing the service provider's equipment operation and defined any such attempt as a material breach. The fine was a penalty for the service provider's equipment operation. The board had issued a fine that materially breached the service agreement and had done so after she had asked in writing whether the agreement permitted it and had received no response. The third reason, the board had just voted to demand service from a contractor whose agreement it had already materially breached, and to threaten legal action against him for exercising the termination right that the same agreement gave him explicitly and unconditionally, with 7 days' notice and no cause required. The legal action threat had no basis in the agreement's terms, and the demand had no basis in contract law as she understood it. She was recording all 3 reasons in the minutes because she wanted the record to reflect that the correct questions had been asked before the decisions that produced this outcome were made. She asked the minute-taker to read it back. The minute-taker read it back. Delia confirmed it was accurate. She asked for a timestamp. The minute-taker added it. Delia photographed the screen with her phone before the meeting closed. Then she looked at Brenda and asked one question. Had Brenda read the service agreement before issuing the fine? Brenda said she had reviewed the relevant provisions. Delia asked, had she read Section 3, subsection 4, specifically, the non-interference clause? Brenda said the aesthetics code applied to all contractors operating in the development. Delia wrote that exchange on the back of her printed meeting agenda, dated it, and put it in her bag. The demand letter went out Friday on HOA letterhead, drafted by Brenda, not reviewed by the contracts attorney who had recommended retraction the previous week, and who had not been told the termination notice had been sent. 1 page. It demanded that Walt rescind the termination notice, resume service effective immediately, pay the outstanding $400 fine within 7 days, and acknowledge in writing that the HOA's aesthetics code applied to his operations within the development. It said failure to comply would result in legal action for breach of community service obligations. Walt received it Saturday morning, the same day the termination notice's 7-day period concluded. He read it at the kitchen table, then set it beside the termination notice he had sent the previous week. He called Nora and read her both documents. She said, "Do not respond. Owen will address it in the complaint." He said he had not planned to respond. He drove to the equipment barn after the call. He opened the main door, walked to the plow truck, and ran a final check. Engine, hydraulics, blade, block heater thermostat, rear ballast. Everything operational, everything exactly as it should be. He was not parking the truck because it had failed, or because the season was over. He was parking it because the agreement that had put it on the Pinecrest Ridge Road had been materially breached and then terminated, and the termination period had run its course. The truck was as ready as it had been on every service day for 11 seasons. The agreement that made it the development's truck was gone. He backed into the barn, shut the engine off, plugged in the block heater, and closed the main door. He turned the padlock on the door hasp and walked back to the farmhouse. He opened his service logbook at the kitchen table and wrote the Saturday date. He wrote, "Agreement terminated. Time. Equipment withdrawn from service. Plow barn locked." He looked at the entry for a moment. Then he opened the regional weather service on his laptop and checked the forecast. A storm system moving in from the northwest. Projected arrival, Monday night into Tuesday morning. Estimated accumulation at the road's midpoint elevation gauge, 16 to 20 inches. He wrote one final line in the logbook entry, below the barn lock notation, in the same steady hand he had used for every entry since 2014. Storm forecast, 72 hours. Accumulation, 16 to 20 inches at elevation. He closed the logbook and looked out the kitchen window at the access road running east from his property line toward the development's entrance. Clear, packed, exactly as he had left it Wednesday morning after the final service run. It would stay that way until Monday night. After that, it would look like what 16 inches of mountain snow looked like on a 1.2-mile private road at 4,200 feet elevation, with no plow contractor assigned to it. He knew exactly what that looked like. He had spent 30 years on mountain infrastructure. He did not need to imagine it. He made lunch and waited for Tuesday. The storm arrived Monday night at 11:15, earlier than the forecast's Tuesday morning projection, the leading edge coming off the northwest ridge in the way mountain storms sometimes came, ahead of schedule, and with the particular density of moisture that the northern range accumulated when the pressure system tracked south of its predicted path. Walt had been watching the approach on the weather radar from his kitchen table since 9 p.m. He had seen the accumulation rate adjust upward at 10 o'clock. The forecast's 16 to 20 inch range revised to 18 to 22 at the road's midpoint elevation. He had closed the weather tab at 11, gone to the equipment barn to confirm the block heater was running correctly on the plow truck, and come back inside. He had not unlocked the barn door. He had checked the heater through the access panel on the barn's east wall, a small hinged cover that allowed him to read the thermostat without entering the main space. The heater was running at the correct temperature. The truck was warm and ready. The barn door was padlocked. He had gone to bed at 11:30. He was up at 3:30 a.m., the habit of 30 years of infrastructure work producing the same pre-dawn wakefulness that storm conditions had always produced. Not anxious, just alert, the professional reflex of a man who had spent 3 decades being the person responsible for what happened to roads in weather like this. He made coffee, looked at the radar, and confirmed the accumulation. 18 inches at his property's elevation gauge, still falling at the rate the revised forecast had projected. He dressed and went outside with his headlamp. He plowed his own property's driveway and access routes between 4 and 5:30 a.m. The main driveway from the farmhouse to the property's western gate, the track from the house to the equipment barn, the feedlot access for the cattle operation, and the eastern access road on his own side of the gate. He ran it with the tractor and the blade he used for property work, not the commercial plow truck. The commercial truck stayed in the barn. His property's routes were clear by 5:45. He drove back to the farmhouse, stamped his boots at the door, and poured a second coffee. He sat at the kitchen table and looked east through the kitchen window. The property gate at the eastern edge was visible in the pre-dawn, a standard ranch gate, chain secured, the kind of gate that had been on that post for 20 years, and that he opened and closed as a routine matter of property management. Beyond the gate, 400 feet to the east, the Pinecrest Ridge entrance markers were barely visible through the falling snow. Beyond the entrance markers, the 1.2-mile access road ran through 18 inches of accumulation toward the county highway. He could not see the road from the kitchen window. He knew exactly what it looked like. The county highway at the road's far end had been plowed at 4 a.m. He had heard the county's plow truck on the highway from his equipment barn during his own property work, the familiar sound of a heavy plow rig running a county route at production speed, the blades scraping clean, and the sand spreader running behind it. The county highway was clear. It had been clear since 4 a.m. The 1.2-mile private road between the county highway and the development's 140 units was filled with 18 inches of mountain snow, and would remain so until either the emergency contractor arrived or the snow compacted enough under its own weight to allow a high-clearance vehicle to push through. The second option was not realistic at 18 inches on the grades the road ran. Brenda called the emergency contractor at 7 a.m. Walt knew she had called because Owen had said she would call, and because the math of the situation left no other option. The 4-hour minimum call-out meant the contractor's earliest possible arrival was 11 a.m., assuming they dispatched immediately and road conditions on the county highway approach allowed normal transit time. The contractor had confirmed 4 hours minimum when Brenda had gotten the quote the previous week, and they had meant it. Their equipment was staged at a yard 15 miles south on the county highway, and the mobilization sequence for a mountain-grade plow at that elevation required pre-run equipment checks, route verification, and a two-person crew for safety on the grades. The contractor arrived at 11:05. By that time, the access road had been impassable for approximately 7 hours. 2 residents had attempted to drive out during that period, the first at 7:15, a pickup truck whose driver had gotten 200 feet into the accumulation before burying the front axle in a drift at the road's first grade. The second at 8:40, a higher clearance SUV whose driver had made it 400 feet before the same result. Both vehicles were still on the road when the contractor arrived, requiring the contractor to maneuver around the first stuck vehicle before establishing a clear run, which added 40 minutes to the initial clearing pass. One resident had called the county non-emergency line at 8 a.m. to report an emergency access concern, a medical appointment at 9:30 that she could not reach. The call was routed to Ray Finch's office because the complaint involved a road condition, and Ray's department was the county's road maintenance point of contact. Ray had taken the call himself. He said the road was a private road with no county maintenance obligation, and that the county could not deploy equipment on private property. He said she should contact the development's property manager about the road condition. He said he was sorry. He took her name and the appointment information and noted them in his morning log. It was the 4th call his office received from Pinecrest Ridge residents that morning. 3 others had called between 7:30 and 8:15, asking why the county had not plowed the access road, and Ray had given each of them the same answer: private road, no county obligation. He had confirmed it 4 times by 8:30 a.m. and filed a single notation covering all 4 calls: Pinecrest Ridge private road, multiple resident inquiries, county maintenance obligation confirmed non-applicable, private contractor matter. Walt sat at his kitchen table through the morning and watched the storm from the kitchen window. The snow had begun to taper by 9 a.m., the accumulation rate decreasing as the storm system's trailing edge moved through, the total settling at 19 inches on his property gauge. He drank coffee and read the previous day's agricultural extension bulletin, the winter grazing supplement recommendations for mountain cattle operations during extended snow cover, and did not check the development's road condition or make any calls. Owen had told him not to respond to the demand letter and not to make contact with the HOA board or any resident during the termination period. He had not. The demand letter sat on the kitchen table where he had left it Saturday morning after reading it to Nora. He had not written on it or moved it. It was a document that had no response coming from his kitchen table, and he had left it in that status. The HOA's demand letter, the non-interference clause, and the termination notice were 3 documents on the same table, and their relationship to each other was simple. The first had demanded a service that the second had protected, and the third had concluded. Walt had followed the sequence correctly. What happened on the access road this Tuesday morning was the consequence of the HOA not following the sequence correctly, issuing a fine that violated a clause that triggered a right that a board president had not read until after the right had been exercised. Delia posted to the development's community forum at 9 a.m. Tuesday. She had been awake since 6, watching the accumulation from her window, aware that the contractor would not arrive until 11 and that the forum would be active by 7:30, with residents asking why the road was not clear. She had read 23 posts before 9 a.m., variations of the same question in different registers, some alarmed, some angry, several addressed to the board asking for an explanation of why the road was not being plowed. She did not answer any of those posts. She posted once, at 9:03. Her post contained no commentary, no explanation, and no editorial framing. It contained a single link, the HOA's own administrative document repository, where the current service agreement had been uploaded as part of the HOA's annual filing, accessible to all residents. The link went directly to the agreement's PDF. She added one sentence below the link. The relevant sections are 3 and 4. She closed her laptop and did not check the thread for an hour. The thread had 47 replies by 9:30. Residents had clicked the link, opened the agreement, and were reading sections 3 and 4 in real time, posting their readings and their conclusions in sequence. By 10 a.m., the thread had 89 replies, and the non-interference clause had been quoted in full 7 times by 7 different residents. By 11, when the contractor arrived and began the first clearing pass, the thread had 140 replies, one for each unit in the development, and the conversation had moved from "what does this mean" to "how did this happen" to "who authorized the fine." At 2 p.m., a resident named Gareth posted the $400 fine letter. He had found it in the board's meeting minutes archive. The HOA's administrative portal included minutes from board meetings going back to 2019, and the January meeting's minutes contained the fine letter as an attachment. He had found it by searching the minutes archive for the word aesthetics after reading section 4.3 of the code cited in the fine letter. He posted it without commentary, the same way Delia had posted the service agreement. The fine letter's attachment showed the date, the $400 amount, the section 4.3 citation, and the tire track description. At 3 p.m., a resident named Calloway posted a calculation. She had looked up the emergency contractor's rate from the community forum's previous comments and had found Garrett Oles' contractor listing on the state database, which showed the standard mountain-grade emergency service rate. She wrote, $400 fine to protect decorative snow at the entrance, $3,200 emergency plow this morning, 11 years of reliable service, not one missed run, terminated with 7 days' notice because of tire tracks on a flagstone apron. She did not editorialize beyond the numbers. She posted the numbers and let the forum decide what they meant. By 4 p.m., the thread had 280 replies. By 5, it had reached 340. The calculation post had been quoted 22 times. Several residents had done their own version of the calculation, extending it to the season's projected remaining events, $3,200 per event, times the 8 to 12 events Garrett's report had projected. Though the residents doing the math did not know about Garrett's report, they were using the contractor's publicly listed rate and the historical snowfall data from the county weather station's public archive. The numbers they arrived at ranged from $25,600 to $38,400. One resident posted, Walt's annual fee was $4,200, and we fined him $400 for a tire track. The math on what we just bought ourselves is on the thread above. The emergency board session convened at 5 p.m. Friday. The storm had deposited its accumulation Monday night. The contractor had plowed Tuesday morning, and the road had been clear from 11 a.m. onward. A secondary system had moved through Thursday with 8 additional inches. Another $3,200 contractor call. Another 4-hour wait. The road had been impassable from 8 p.m. Wednesday night until noon Thursday. A second calculation thread had appeared on the forum Wednesday evening and had 190 replies by the time the contractor arrived Thursday. Brenda arrived at the common room first. She sat at the table with her phone. Holt arrived second. Vesper arrived third, quieter than usual, his own copy of the forum threads printed and folded in his jacket pocket. Delia arrived at 4:58, carrying a manila folder. She sat down, opened the folder, and placed 3 documents on the table in front of her chair. The first was the non-interference clause, Section 3, Subsection 4, photocopied from the service agreement and highlighted in yellow on the operative sentence. The HOA shall not penalize the service provider's equipment operation during the agreement's active term. The second document was her original email to Brenda, printed on a single page, the Monday evening message sent before the fine letter was issued, with the non-interference clause photograph attached, the sent timestamp visible at the top, and below it her first follow-up, and her second follow-up, each with its timestamp, and below the last follow-up, blank space, no reply. The absence of 3 replies visible on the same printed page. The third document was the emergency contractor's invoice for Tuesday's service call, $3,200, 4-hour minimum, mountain-grade service, Pinecrest Ridge Access Road, Tuesday date. She set all 3 documents side by side in the center of the table and folded her hands. She did not speak. Outside, the access road had been plowed once since the termination. The forum had 340 replies on the first storm thread and 190 on the second. The contractor's next call was $3,200 away. The storm forecast for the coming week showed another front in 96 hours. The Weather Service's mountain elevation projection showing 14 to 16 inches at the road's gauge. The three documents on the table said everything that needed to be said about a $400 fine for tire tracks in decorative snow, the non-interference clause, the unanswered emails, the $3,200 invoice. Brenda opened her folder and looked at what she had prepared to say. Outside, in the equipment barn 400 feet west of where the board was sitting, the plow truck was warm and operational, the block heater running, the blade in transport position, the hydraulic lines at temperature. It had been ready every day since the barn door was locked. It would be ready the day after this meeting, and the day after that, and every day through April. Whether it would be ready on the Pinecrest Ridge Road was a question that had been answered by a $400 fine for tire tracks, and the documents on the table explained exactly how. Brenda resigned Sunday morning by email. 2 sentences. Stepping down effective immediately. She sent it at 8:50 and did not follow up. Delia read it at 9:30, forwarded it to Owen's office with one line. Assuming interim presidency, available by phone at 1 p.m. Owen replied within 10 minutes. Confirmed. She called at 1 exactly. Owen let her speak first. She said full settlement. She asked, "What does Walt need?" Owen presented 4 terms. 1. The $400 fine retracted and formally voided in the board record. Not removed, voided. With the retraction and its basis entered into the permanent meeting minutes, so that the record reflected not just the fine's absence, but the reason for its removal. 2. A written apology to Walt entered into the HOA's permanent minutes. Not a private communication, a recorded apology in the board's official record, acknowledging that the fine violated the service agreement's non-interference clause, and that the HOA's failure to read the agreement before issuing the fine had produced the service interruption. 3. The agreement reinstated at Walt's option, under revised terms. The revised terms: $5,800 per season, an increase of $1,600 from the prior rate. The non-interference clause strengthened with a liquidated damages provision. Any future violation assessed at $1,000 per incident, payable to Walt within 30 days of the violation without dispute. The termination notice period reduced from 7 days to 48 hours at Walt's election, meaning if the HOA violated the agreement again, Walt could be out in 2 days, not 7. 4. A recorded acknowledgement in the HOA's permanent documents. Not a settlement letter, but a formal board resolution entered into the minutes, stating that the Pinecrest Ridge access road had no alternative snow removal arrangement, that Walt's service was provided at his sole discretion under a private bilateral agreement, and that the service was not a community obligation, a guaranteed utility, or a managed HOA amenity. The resolution would travel with the HOA's governing record permanently. Delia confirmed all 4 without hesitation. Owen then said he had a 5th term to recommend, from a risk management perspective. He said the HOA's fundamental exposure was the assumption that Walt's service would continue regardless of how the agreement was treated. The assumption needed a financial counterweight. He recommended a 3-year advance service payment deposited in escrow, $17,400, representing 3 full seasons at the revised rate, held by a neutral title company and released to Walt at each October renewal as performance assurance. If the HOA terminated the agreement or breached it, the escrow balance released to Walt immediately as liquidated damages. Delia said yes before Owen finished the sentence. Garrett Ohl had sent Owen a supplemental note after completing his sealed impact assessment, a professional recommendation he felt belonged in any resolution of the matter. He recommended the HOA establish a formal backup contractor retainer with the $3,200 per event contractor as a documented contingency, a signed retainer agreement funded from the HOA's road maintenance reserve, obligating the contractor to respond within 4 hours on seasonal call, not as a replacement for Walt's service, as a documented backup for any future gap. Owen added it as a 6th term. He called Walt to confirm. Walt said yes immediately. He said it was the term he had wondered whether anyone would think to include. Walt signed Thursday afternoon. 4 terms, then a 5th, then a 6th. Each one read completely before the pen touched the signature line. He signed the last page at 3:51. He drove back to the property. He did not go inside. He walked to the equipment barn, unlocked the padlock, and opened the main door. 19 days since he had closed it. He walked to the plow truck, disconnected the block heater, ran the startup sequence: engine, hydraulics, blade cycle, rear ballast check. Everything operational. He had maintained the truck correctly. It had been ready every one of those 19 days. It was ready now. Friday morning at 6:08, he drove the full 1.2-mile service corridor, County Highway N to the development's internal turnaround and back. Not a service run, a road check. He drove it at walking pace, the blade in transport position, reading the surface the way he had read it for 11 seasons. The two grades, the drainage cross-sections, the areas where compaction varied under heavy accumulation. The road was in serviceable condition. The contractor's 2 event response runs had cleared the surface adequately, though without the packed base Walt built through consistent seasonal maintenance. It would need 2 or 3 runs to restore the base profile he maintained. He noted the condition at each grade change. He drove back to the barn and parked. He opened his service logbook at the kitchen table. He wrote the Friday date and the time. He wrote, "Service resumed, 6:08 a.m., full corridor driven. Road condition, serviceable, base restoration required, 2 to 3 runs. Agreement reinstated. Revised terms, $5,800 per season. Liquidated damages $1,000 per violation. 48-hour termination at Walt's election. Escrow, $17,400. 3-year advance, neutral title. Backup contractor. Retainer executed." He paused. Then he wrote the last line of the entry. R.E. Non-interference clause. Enforceable. Matter closed. Nora called that evening. She asked how the road looked. He thought about it for a moment. The surface condition, the grade profiles, the base work it needed, the 19 days it had gone without the maintenance that kept it in the condition it needed to be in. He said, "It looks like a road that knows who plows it." She was quiet for a moment, the way she got quiet when something her father said landed exactly right. Then she said she would drive up in 2 weeks. He said the guest room was ready. He called Ray Finch's office before he went to bed and left a message scheduling the annual road condition review for the first week of October. Same week as every year. Same call he had made every year since he had started the service in 2014. He set the logbook on the kitchen table, opened to the current page, and turned off the kitchen light. Outside, the service road ran from his property's eastern gate to the county highway in the dark, clear and packed where the contractor had worked it, waiting for the base runs that would restore it to the standard Walt had maintained for 11 seasons. The plow truck was in the barn, warm, the block heater reconnected, the blade in transport position. The escrow was funded. The backup retainer was signed. The non-interference clause had a $1,000 consequence attached to it now, and the termination clock ran 48 hours at Walt's election. The agreement was better than it had been. The road would be better than it had been. The logbook was open on the kitchen table. First week of October, same as every year.